I want to pick up exactly where the last part of this story left off. I want to take you back to that very table, inside that kitchen, suspended in the heavy, suffocating silence that followed immediately after Caroline looked me in the eye and told me the house would need to be hers. She didn't scream it. She didn't deliver it as a demand born out of anger, resentment, or desperation. No, she said it the way a person mentions the afternoon weather, an upcoming weekend forecast, or a passing summer cloud. It was a casual phrase, a simple, cold fact laid down between us on the polished wood of the dining table, offered up as though the entire matter had already been thoroughly discussed, negotiated, decided, and settled, long before we ever sat down for dinner that evening. I remember the exact way the ambient light from the backyard landscape caught the sharp edge of her wine glass, casting a long, distorted shadow across the linen placemats. I remember the absolute mathematical stillness of the air in the room, so thick and heavy that I could distinctly hear the quiet, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the far corner of the kitchen. I had let that sentence sit there in the open space, hanging between us like heavy winter smoke from a dying fire, for what felt like an absolute eternity, before I allowed myself to formulate an answer to it. Now, I want to tell you exactly what I said next in that quiet room. I want to give you the precise, unaltered words that left my mouth, and I want to describe exactly what those words did to her posture, her expression, and her confidence. Because this right here, is the specific part of the story that shattered the grand illusion we had maintained for nearly 2 decades. This is the moment that fundamentally changed every single thing that came after it, shifting the very ground beneath our feet until nothing recognizable or salvageable was left of the life we knew. For 18 years we had operated our household under a shared language, or at least a language I blindly and foolishly believed we shared. We had built an entire existence on comfortable assumptions and unspoken agreements. But as I sat there on that cold evening, looking directly at the woman across from me, I realized with brutal clarity that we had been living in 2 entirely different, parallel realities. In her reality, this conversation was a calculated chess move, a systematic, cold-blooded division of spoils at the end of a game she honestly thought she had controlled from the very first day. In my reality, it was the final, quiet autopsy of a life I had spent nearly 20 years building with my own 2 hands, my own sweat, and my own sleepless nights. I leaned back slowly in my heavy wooden chair, consciously resisting the sudden, primal urge to slam my hands down on the table or let the rhythm of my breathing change. I simply looked at her face, seeing the sharp lines of her features clearly for perhaps the first time in our entire adult lives, and I told her, without a single doubt in my mind, that the marriage was over. I said it plainly, letting each word occupy its own space in the room. I said it without any sharp edge in my voice, completely devoid of bitterness, hatred, or theatrical drama, because by that point in the evening, there was absolutely nothing left to argue about. The argument had died days ago, buried under the weight of the financial discoveries and betrayals I had meticulously unearthed in the dark. She was right about that much, at least, and I wanted her to hear me agree with the one single thing she had said that night that was actually undeniably true. The space between us was no longer a home where memories were shared. It was a crime scene, and we were just 2 separate people standing among the smoking wreckage, waiting for the dust to clear so we could see the true damage. I watched her eyes search mine for a reaction, looking frantically for the anger, the tears, or the venom she had likely prepared herself to face when she rehearsed this scene in her head. When you betray someone the way she betrayed me, you naturally expect a storm. You weaponize your defenses for shouting, for emotional outbursts, for flying accusations that you can easily deflect with practiced excuses. But silence? Calm, absolute agreement? That is a psychological landscape people like Caroline do not know how to navigate. It robs them instantly of their defensive leverage, strips away their prepared counter-arguments, and leaves them completely exposed to the cold reality of the room. Then, I told her she was free to leave the house whenever she wished. I spelled it out for her, word by word, slowing down my cadence to make sure the immense gravity of my lack of resistance washed over her completely. I told her I would not stand in her way, that I would not block the door, and that I would not file emergency motions to freeze her immediate personal assets. I told her I would not call her names to our mutual friends, nor would I spend my evenings spinning a pathetic narrative of victimhood to her immediate family members. I promised her right then and there that I would not make a single, desperate, late-night phone call to anyone we knew meant to turn people against her or poison the social circles we had spent a lifetime cultivating. I told her that whatever shred of dignity she had left in the eyes of the people who knew us both was entirely hers to keep, to manage, and to protect. I said this not out of a sense of weakness, but because I had absolutely no interest in destroying her. I had no desire to see her ruined in the public eye, no hidden, burning thirst for a public execution of her character. I only had a singular, fierce, and uncompromising interest in not being destroyed myself. I was protecting my own perimeter, locking down my own life. What happened outside of those borders was no longer my concern, my business, or my responsibility. As I sat there watching her, my mind briefly flashed back to a Tuesday morning 11 years ago, inside the downtown office of my old accountant. Pruitt. The room had smelled of old paper, leather-bound ledgers, and stale black coffee. Pruitt was a man who didn't believe in financial optimism. He believed in historical precedent and structural integrity. I remember him sitting behind a massive desk cluttered with tax codes, taking off his reading glasses, and looking at me with eyes that had seen 3 generations of family businesses rise and fall. "Daniel," Pruitt had said, his voice dry and scratchy like sandpaper, "wealth isn't about how much money you spend or how large your driveway is. Wealth is about insulation. You build walls not because you expect a storm today, but because it is the nature of the world to eventually turn cold. Your business needs a shield, and your personal assets need a fortress. If you build everything inside a single bucket, all it takes is one person with a shovel to tip it over." At the time, I had laughed it off. I was young, newly married, and deeply convinced that our partnership was an unbreakable bond that would defy the statistics of modern relationships. I told Pruitt that Caroline and I didn't need fortresses, we shared everything. We had a joint bank account for wedding gifts, we talked about our budget over dinner, and we were planning a life together. But Pruitt didn't smile. He just nodded slowly, reached into his drawer, and pulled out a clean corporate filing document. "The corporate shield I am proposing isn't an act of distrust against your wife, Daniel," he had said softly, pointing a blunt finger at the signature line. "It is a structure designed to protect the business entity from external liabilities, lawsuits, and unforeseen financial collapses. It separates your personal identity from the commercial machine that generates your income. Sign it, Let me build the holding companies and place the real estate inside the trust. If your marriage lasts forever, these papers will simply sit in a file cabinet, collecting dust, hurting no one. But if the world turns cold, you will thank an old man for giving you a floor that cannot be pulled out from under you. I had signed the papers back then simply to satisfy his old-school caution, never imagining for a single second that those exact documents would become the definitive shoreline of my survival. I had walked out of his office into the bright morning sun, completely forgetting the names of the holding companies and the intricate legal clauses he had woven into our asset architecture. For over a decade, those papers remained untouched, invisible, and completely silent, buried beneath the daily routines of our lives, the holidays, the summer vacations, the kitchen renovations, and the quiet weekend mornings. Caroline never asked about them because the money always flowed smoothly into the household accounts, providing a seamless, elegant lifestyle that required no structural investigation. She enjoyed the shade of the tree without ever once wondering who had planted the roots or how deep they went into the earth. The memory faded, and the reality of the kitchen rushed back in. I watched her shoulders ease slightly when I finished speaking. It was a fascinating, almost mechanical thing to witness. The smallest, most imperceptible release of physical tension in her upper body. Her posture shifted just a fraction of an inch, her rigid neck relaxing slightly into the high, upholstered back of her dining chair. It was the exact kind of physical relief you see in a criminal or a desperate gambler who truly believes the worst, most dangerous part of a terrible interrogation has already passed. I understood exactly what was happening inside her mind as I watched her in that fleeting moment of false safety. She honestly believed she had won the day. She believed she had successfully made it through the fire of my initial discovery, that her long-term calculated gamble had paid off, and that she was going to walk away from the smoking ashes of our shared life with the house, the lifestyle, and everything she had set her sights on months ago. She thought my calm demeanor was a sign of total defeat, a white flag hoisted by a man who was simply too tired, too broken, and too spent to fight back. I let her believe that for a few seconds longer. I let her sit in that comfortable, warm bath of unearned victory for exactly as long as it took me to shift my physical weight, lean forward over the table, and reach into the heavy leather folder I had brought into the room with me. I want to tell you more about that folder, because it had been the source of a great deal of internal debate and anxiety the night before. I had thought long and hard, walking the floors of my office until 3 a.m, about whether to bring it into the room at all. Reyes, my divorce attorney, a man with a graying beard and a cold, clinical view of human relationships, had told me flatly the evening prior that I didn't need to prove anything to Caroline that night. He had sat across from me in his sterile, modern office, tapping his silver pen against the mahogany desk, and reminded me that the legal documents existed regardless of whether she saw them in that kitchen or not. The law didn't require a dramatic revelation at a dinner table. The holding company structures were real, the asset allocations were locked, and a formal, certified letter from his office arriving via a courier days later would achieve the exact same legal and structural result, without any of the emotional theater. But as I lay awake that night, watching the headlights of passing cars cast fleeting shadows across the bedroom ceiling, I realized I didn't want a stranger in a tailored suit to deliver my reality to the woman I had shared a bed with for 18 years. I decided right then that I wanted her to hear it directly from my mouth. I wanted it spoken in my own voice, within the familiar walls of our own kitchen, at the very table where we had shared thousands of ordinary breakfasts, hosted holiday parties, and mapped out a future that was now nothing more than a collection of ghost stories. I felt I owed her that much, even now, even after the magnitude of her betrayal. It wasn't because she deserved gentleness, kindness, or special courtesy. Let's be completely clear about that. It was because of who I wanted to remain on the other side of this tragedy. I did not want to become a coward who delivered hard, life-altering truths from a safe distance, hiding behind expensive legal stationery and professional proxies instead of looking the person I had loved in the eye and saying it directly to her face. I wanted to look her in the eyes when her illusion fell apart. So, with a steady, unhurried hand, I opened the leather folder. The click of the metal clasps sounded like a sudden gunshot in the quiet room. I reached inside, pulled out a stack of crisp documents, and set the deed to the property flat on the table between us, right over the polished wood. It was the original deed. The heavy parchment paper, crisp, white, and uncreased, bore my name and my name alone on the primary ownership line. It was dated years ago, long before either of us had any earthly reason to think about what a divorce would someday cost, or what it would feel like to sit across from each other as legal adversaries. I watched her eyes drop to the document, her gaze fixing on the official county stamp and the notarized seal at the top of the page. I looked at the paper. Then I looked up at her eyes, and I told her the truth that would permanently rewrite the history of the last 18 years of her life. I told her that the house she had just casually claimed as her prize, the house she thought she could trade for her exit, had never, for a single solitary day of our marriage, belonged to her. I didn't wait for her to process the words. I kept my voice even, steady, and unhurried as I laid out the hidden architecture of her new reality. I told her that this entire property sat safely inside a complex holding company structure, a corporate shield that had been meticulously built and finalized years earlier, long before she and I had ever exchanged vows or walked down an aisle. It was a structure put together on the private advice of Pruitt, a man she had heard me mention 100 times over the years, but had never once asked to meet or join for lunch, simply because she had always found the granular details of my business dealings, corporate filings, and financial planning to be incredibly boring and beneath her attention. I didn't stop there. I wanted the full scope of her financial miscalculation to be completely undeniable, leaving no room for her to run to a lawyer with false hope. I told her that the household bank accounts she managed day to day, the ones that paid for the organic groceries in the pantry, the high-end landscaping for the expansive garden outside, and the very crystal glasses resting on the table right in front of us were never owned by her. They were not joint marital accounts. They were separate corporate accounts, funded generously, consistently, and seamlessly at my sole discretion by a parent business enterprise that had never once listed her name on any operational document that mattered. For nearly 2 decades, she had signed checks, swiped credit cards, and managed the elegant aesthetics of a wealthy suburban life, operating under the comfortable, arrogant assumption that access to money was the exact same thing as ownership of the asset. I had to correct that assumption tonight, right here, under the kitchen lights. I watched the calculation return to her face. It came back faster this time, and noticeably colder, because now her mind had real, hard legal numbers to work with instead of vague assumptions emotional manipulation, and social leverage. Caroline has always been incredibly quick with numbers, provided, of course, that those numbers favor her immediate interests. She is a woman who thoroughly understands value, who understands strategic positioning, and who has an innate, highly developed sense for where the financial power lies in any room she enters. Sitting there in the quiet kitchen, I could practically see the gears turning behind her eyes as the adrenaline hit her system. I watched her run the exact same mental arithmetic she must have run 100 times over the past 18 years. The comfortable, secure arithmetic of a woman who genuinely believed she owned exactly half of everything simply because she had lived inside the walls, decorated the rooms, and walked its halls as the mistress of the house. And for the first time in her entire adult life, I watched that arithmetic fail her completely, totally, without any margin for error or emotional appeal. She reached out her hand and picked up the heavy parchment deed from the table. Her fingers trembled just slightly at the edges. A tiny, involuntary betrayal of the perfect composure she was fighting so desperately to maintain. I let her hold it. In fact, I wanted her to hold it. I wanted her to physically feel the weight of her new reality in her hands. I wanted her to see my name typed there in plain, unforgiving black ink, dated, stamped, and notarized by the county clerk. A legal reality that was far older than any romantic promise or marital vow either of us had ever whispered to each other in the quiet hours of this house. She read the first page once. Then, her jaw tightening until the muscles showed along her neck, she read it twice. I sat in perfect, unmoving silence, watching her eyes dart back and forth over the same precise lines of legal jargon, desperately searching for a loophole, a hidden phrase, a shared clause, a survivorship right, or a joint tenancy agreement, anything at all that might suggest a fraction of this property still belonged to her or could be dragged into a messy court battle. But there was absolutely nothing for her to find. Pruitt had built this corporate structure with the exact same obsessive, airtight, and merciless care he brought to everything he touched in his professional life, and Reyes had spent the last 48 hours confirming every single line, amendment, and corporate filing twice over to ensure there were no cracks in the armor. The house was an isolated island, and she was standing alone on the fading shore, watching the last rescue boat pull away into the fog. When she finally looked up from the paper, the long-standing performance was gone. The poise, the practiced indifference, the calm, regal mask of a woman who held all the cards and controlled the narrative, it vanished completely in an instant, melting away to reveal the raw, unadulterated panic underneath. What was left on her face was something I had never, in 18 years of marriage, seen before. It wasn't anger. Not yet, anyway. Anger requires a deep sense of grievance, a feeling that you have been wrongfully, unfairly deprived of something that legitimately belongs to you. What I saw instead was something far more profound, far more terrifying for someone of her nature. It was total, absolute disorientation. It was the specific, terrifying look of a person who suddenly realizes that the solid concrete floor they have walked across with absolute confidence every single day of their adult life had never actually been load-bearing. She was suspended in mid-air. The illusion had shattered, and gravity was finally starting to take a brutal hold of her life. The silence stretched between us, longer, heavier, and colder this time, until she finally broke it with a voice that didn't sound like hers. Her voice was different now, smaller, raspy, stripped of its previous elite authority. She looked at me and asked me how long I had known. But she wasn't just asking about the hidden room in the city, or the sordid details of the affair itself, or the 10 days of agonizing, watchful silence I had already confessed to harboring while I gathered my thoughts. She looked down at the deed in her trembling hand, then back up at my face, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion, and asked how long I had known about the house, the accounts, the corporate structures, all of it. She thought I had set a long-term trap for her. She thought I had spent our entire marriage spinning a dark web in the background, waiting for her to make a mistake so I could pull the cord and watch her fall into financial ruin. Her mind, built entirely on transactions and leverage, couldn't comprehend that safety could exist without malice, or that a man could protect his life without planning an ambush. I looked at her, letting the silence reinforce my position, and I told her the absolute truth. I told her that I had known about her affair for exactly 10 days. That was the narrow, painful window of my heartbreak. That was the exact duration of time I had spent looking at old family photographs, remembering our early days, and wondering how a life could split completely down the middle without making a single sound to warn you. But then I told her something else, and I watched this specific realization land on her psyche harder and heavier than anything else I said that entire night. I told her that the structure of our finances, the legal separation of the assets, and the sole ownership of the house had been a concrete, unyielding reality for over a decade. It was unchanged, unused, and completely unbothered by the passage of time, simply sitting there in the dark, dusty archives of the State Department, exactly the way Pruitt had built it long before I ever had a single reason to suspect she would give me a cause to look at it closely. I made sure she understood that I had not built this system as a weapon or a trap for her. I hadn't spent our marriage planning for her inevitable betrayal or anticipating the dark night she would break my trust. I had built it unknowingly as a boring standard financial foundation for asset protection against outside liabilities, commercial risks, and business lawsuits. It had simply been waiting there the entire time we were married, utterly indifferent to whether our love lasted for half a century or fell apart in a single, ugly afternoon. The architecture of the law didn't care about our romantic vows. It only cared about the legal names written on the dotted line. It didn't exist to hurt her. It existed because the world outside our home was unpredictable, and I had wanted to make sure my family was safe from the storm. The bitter irony, of course, was that the danger hadn't come from a bad business deal or an outside lawsuit at all. The danger had been sitting across from me at the dinner table every single night, eating my food and planning her escape. She swallowed hard, her eyes glassing over with unshed tears as she stared blankly at the dark edge of the table. She asked why I had never told her during all those years of marriage. It was a fair question, I suppose, if you view a marriage as a series of strategic disclosures, hidden cards, and secret weapons. But I gave her the only honest, unfiltered answer I had left in my heart. I told her that for 18 years, it had quite simply never once occurred to me that I would need to explain it to her. I leaned in closer across the table, wanting her to understand the profound philosophical tragedy of what she had done to us. I told her that trust, real, foundational, unspoken trust, is the very thing that allows two people to live together for 2 decades and never once discuss who technically owns the roof over their heads or whose name is stamped on the deed in the county clerk's office. You don't talk about it because neither person ever believes it will matter. You don't check the paperwork because you believe the partnership is the true security. I told her that she was the one who had fundamentally, permanently transformed a marriage of trust into a marriage of ownership. She had made that fateful choice the exact moment she decided to risk everything we had built together on the arrogant belief that I would never notice her absence, that I was too comfortable and soft to ask hard questions, and that I would never look closely enough at our financial life to understand what was actually legally mine. She had assumed my silence over the years was a sign of ignorance, and she had gambled her entire future on that single, fatal assumption. She thought she was playing chess with a man who didn't know the rules. But she forgot that I was the one who had built the board. Now the bill had come due, the game was over, and she didn't have a single piece left to play. Caroline did not respond to that. She couldn't find the words to counter a reality that was so clinical, so precise, and so completely documented. The truth of it was too heavy, too undeniable to be argued away with cheap excuses, forced tears, or historical revisions of our relationship. For a long, agonizing, suffocating moment, the kitchen returned to that absolute, heavy silence. I want to be completely honest with you about what I saw in her face during that prolonged quiet, because I have thought about that specific expression many times in the months and years that have followed this night. It was not remorse. Let's not romanticize her or turn her into a tragic heroine. It wasn't the sudden, painful awakening of a sleeping conscience, realizing the massive emotional damage it had inflicted on a loyal partner. No, it was something much colder. It was the particular icy stillness of an opportunist recalculating an entire future in real time. I was watching her look at the golden version of her life she had already begun planning quietly in her own head over the last year. The comfortable alimony payments, the retention of this beautiful estate, the seamless transition into her new chapter with her lover, funded entirely by the financial spoils of her old life. And I was watching that entire mental empire collapse into worthless dust right before my eyes. I watched her mind frantically try to piece together the wreckage, trying to rearrange the broken fragments into something far smaller, far tighter, and far more restrictive than she had ever expected she would have to endure in her adult life. She was realizing, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that the lifestyle she had cultivated wasn't hers to keep. The safety net she had assumed was woven into the very fabric of her marriage certificate was nothing more than a desert mirage. She looked down at her manicured hands, which were still resting near the edge of the deed, and she asked me, finally, a single, quiet question. What happens now, Daniel? I told her the truth, the same unvarnished, legal truth that Reyes had helped me accept and internalize 2 weeks earlier when I first brought the evidence of her infidelity to his desk. I told her that the marriage would end. It would end cleanly, quietly, and through the proper legal channels, without unnecessary public noise, social media drama, or public scenes, but without any room for negotiation, leverage, or compromise. I told her she would leave this marriage with everything the law protected fairly and equitably for any spouse in this jurisdiction: her own personal savings accounts, her car, her jewelry, and her exact documented share of anything we had genuinely built jointly outside of the pre-existing company structure. But I made sure the boundary was crystal clear, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation or future legal challenges. I told her she would not be leaving with this house. She would not leave with a single share of my business enterprise. and she would not have a single dollar of access to the corporate accounts that had never belonged to her in the first place. I looked directly into her tearing eyes, and I told her that this was not an act of revenge. This was not a cruel punishment designed to make her suffer, crawl, or grovel for my amusement. It was simply the truth, a legal and financial reality arriving 10 years later than either of us had any reason to expect it would, but arriving nonetheless, with all the absolute, terrifying certainty of a closing vault door. She had spent years living a luxurious life funded by a structure she didn't own, and today, that funding had reached its permanent, unyielding expiration date. She sat there for a long time, the weight of the finality settling deep into her bones, slowing her breathing until she looked almost like a pale marble statue under the warm kitchen lights. Then, she asked a question that caught me entirely off guard, breaking through my clinical defense mechanism. She looked up, her voice cracking slightly at the edge, losing its smooth cadence, and asked if I hated her. I remember that specific question vividly, even now, because it was the very first thing she had asked me that entire evening that wasn't directly tied to the ownership of the house, or the stability of the money, or the cold, hard arithmetic of what she stood to lose in the divorce courts. It wasn't a tactical question designed to find a legal weakness or a soft spot in my resolve. It was, as far as I could tell, an actual, raw, human question asked by an actual person hidden underneath the heavy layers of performance, calculation, and deceit that had defined her presence for so long at that table. I took a deep, steady breath, looked directly into her eyes, and I told her the truth, because despite everything she had stolen from our history and our memories, I felt I still owed her the basic dignity of an honest answer to an honest question. I told her that I did not hate her. I watched her brow furrow slightly, her mind trying to understand how that could be possible given the icy coldness of my posture and the finality of my terms. I explained it to her plainly, without any anger. I told her that hate is an active, passionate, and deeply invested emotion. It requires immense psychological energy, continuous emotional investment, and a lingering attachment to the person who wronged you. Hate would have required me to still be shocked by what she had done in that city room. It would have required me to still hold on to some lingering, desperate expectation of her loyalty, some baseline belief that she was fundamentally incapable of this level of cold-blooded betrayal. And the reality was, I was no longer surprised by anything she did. The shock had burned itself out days ago, in the quiet, lonely hours of my private investigation. I told her that what I felt radiating inside my chest wasn't anger, malice, or a desire for her destruction. It was closer to pure grief. But it was a very specific, strange, and hollow kind of grief that has no proper name in our language. It was the particular empty sorrow of losing a version of a person you had spent 18 years believing existed, while the actual, real person sat right across the table from you the entire time, whole, unbroken, completely unbothered, and simply entirely different than the person you thought you had married. I wasn't mourning the loss of the woman sitting in front of me tonight. I was mourning the ghost of a woman who had never actually been there at all. I was mourning the years, the energy, and the love I had invested in a beautiful illusion. The realization hitting me like a physical blow that the past 18 years hadn't been a shared journey of two souls, but a solo flight I had taken alone, while she watched my progress from a calculated, transactional distance. She cried then. It wasn't the theatrical, manipulative tears I had seen her use in past arguments over the years to win a point, soften a blow, or redirect my attention from her mistakes. These were quiet, heavy, real tears, the very first genuine human emotion she had displayed the entire evening. They rolled down her cheeks, breaking through her makeup, and fell onto the polished wood of the dining table, right next to the crisp, sharp edge of the deed. And I want to tell you something incredibly important about that moment in the kitchen. I want to tell you that I did not reach across the table to take her hand. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not slide my chair closer, and I did not utter a single word of comfort to ease her sobbing. But I didn't get up and walk away either. I didn't storm out of the room to leave her alone in her misery, and I didn't lock myself in another part of the house to avoid the discomfort. I simply sat there, perfectly still, at the very table we had eaten dinner at for 18 years, and I let her cry without making any attempt to fix it, minimize it, or soften the blow. I sat there because I had learned something incredibly profound and liberating over the agonizing 10 days of watchful silence that preceded this night. I had learned that not every single pain in a room is yours to manage or cure. Sometimes, people have to sit in the very fire they built for themselves with their own actions, and it is an act of pure, essential self-preservation to let them burn until they finally understand the true heat of their own choices. We didn't finish every single detail that night. Of course we didn't. You cannot dismantle an 18-year life, a massive estate, and a complex financial history in a single sitting over a half-empty bottle of wine in a darkened kitchen. There would be many more conversations in the difficult weeks that followed, colder, sharper ones, mediated by aggressive lawyers in sterile corporate conference rooms with harsh fluorescent lighting and bad coffee. There would be mountains of paperwork to sign, asset verifications to submit, logistical details to iron out, and all the slow, practical, agonizing structural unraveling that any long-term marriage requires, even one that ends with this much absolute clarity, legal finality, and structural division. But I want to end this specific part of the story right here, in this kitchen, with the original deed still lying flat on the dark, polished wood of the table between us. I choose to freeze the frame here because that specific visual image is the one that remains burned most clearly into my mind whenever I look back on the wreckage of everything that happened between us. When I think of the definitive end of my marriage, I don't think of the affair itself. I don't think of the hotel rooms, or the man in the city, or the text messages, or the 10 days of suffocating silence I endured while tracking the truth through bank statements, cell phone records, and investigator reports. I think of this, a single, crisp piece of parchment paper, older than either of us expected it to matter, quietly, legally, and permanently deciding an argument that 18 years of marriage had never once needed to have. It was the silent, unyielding arbiter of our truth, standing guard over the life I had built with my own hands, long after the love that supposedly inspired it had been swept away by betrayal. What came next? The messy, cold mechanics of her packing her things into cardboard boxes. How she finally walked out that front door for the last time without looking back at the house, and the chilling, unforgettable words she whispered to me on the very last morning she ever woke up inside this house. That is the next part of this story, and it is a part I am finally ready to tell you.